If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The North Atlantic coast felt colder than usual that morning. Wind came in heavy bursts, pushing sheets of gray mist across the rocks. The test site was little more than a line of temporary wooden huts, a generator shack, a steel platform overlooking the sea, and a narrow path for the truck that carried equipment. Waves hit the rust-colored stones with a dull, heavy sound that never stopped. The air smelled of salt, wet rope, and cold metal. Elise Moreau arrived before the others, as she always did. She carried a small notebook under her arm, her hair pinned back in a way that kept it out of her eyes while she worked. Her hands were steady, but her face showed signs of exhaustion. Dark circles, a tired jaw, the kind of stillness that came from too many nights spent awake. She was a trained explosives technician from France, evacuated through Spain after her town fell under German control. She had seen buildings collapse, friends disappear, and her family scattered. She came here because it was the only place the Allies would let her continue her work, and because designing weapons felt like a way to push back against the people who took everything from her. Her main assignment was simple in theory: assist American engineers testing a new naval mine. The device was supposed to detect the pressure signature of large ships and detonate with precision. On paper, it was advanced. In reality, most of the men called it a waste of steel. Elise didn't argue with them. She wrote down every test result, inspected each damaged part, and treated the device as if it deserved respect. She didn't want anyone to die. She wanted the chance to keep more French families from suffering what hers had endured. She was kneeling beside the mine when she heard footsteps behind her. Not hurried, not loud, measured. When she glanced over her shoulder, she saw Corporal Daniel Reeves walking toward her, his jacket unbuttoned and his toolbox hanging from his hand. He looked like a man who had slept on a cot for months and stopped expecting comfort. His face was calm, but tense in a way that never fully relaxed. Daniel had been assigned to this remote station after losing his younger brother early in the war. The boy's ship had gone down in the Atlantic, and Daniel had never forgiven himself for encouraging him to enlist. Since then, the ocean had become a constant reminder of failure. Testing a mine that might keep other sailors alive felt like a responsibility he couldn't ignore. He crouched beside Elise, opening his toolbox without saying a word. The release clamp was bent again from the previous test, something he had already fixed twice. Their shoulders were close as they worked. She held the stabilizer. He tightened the bolts. Their communication remained brief. "Clamps warped," Daniel said quietly. "I noted it," Elise replied, her voice low. "They won't approve redesign unless it fails in the field." "It will," he said. "Soon." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no irritation, just a tired certainty. Elise didn't know much about him yet, only that he didn't laugh with the other engineers and didn't complain about the cold. He worked carefully, listened more than he spoke, and moved with a heaviness that suggested he carried something he never talked about. A group of American engineers gathered a short distance away. Elise could hear them joking about the mine again, calling it useless, calling the assignment punishment duty. One of them glanced toward Elise with dismissive amusement. "Don't pay attention," Daniel murmured without looking up. "I don't," she answered, though part of her did. Refugee or not, she needed to prove her place here. He tightened one more bolt, then sat back on his heels. "It'll hold for the next test," he said. "Barely." She nodded and closed her notebook. For a moment, they stayed in silence. Not awkward, simply quiet. The kind of silence people share when they understand each other's fatigue without needing to explain it. The officer in charge called them over. Another trial run. Another chance for the mine to fail. As the team prepared the crane, Elise watched Daniel examining the sea with a faraway look. The water meant something to him, something painful. She didn't ask, but she saw the way his jaw tightened each time the waves struck the rocks. Their main mission, printed clearly on their orders, was to evaluate the weapon and produce an operational model before the end of winter. But for Elise and Daniel, the mission was more personal. They needed this mine to work for reasons they could never fully explain to the rest of the team. Elise wanted to reclaim something taken from her. Daniel wanted to prevent another loss. When the crane lifted the mine and the cables strained against the weight, Elise and Daniel stood side by side. The wind picked up, pulling at their clothes. The sea roared a little louder. The test, like every other attempt, was a mix of pressure, fear, and quiet determination. Elise tightened her grip on her clipboard. Daniel adjusted the final switch. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were two people who had survived different wars before ever coming here. And this cold stretch of coastline was where their paths began to shift. The test began with the same routine as every morning, but the air felt heavier after the unstable clamp incident. The officers stood on the platform with their binoculars, shouting instructions through the wind. The crane lowered the mine slowly toward the water, its chains rattling under the weight. Elise stood beside Daniel on the metal deck, watching the device sway. The cold pressed into their faces until their skin felt numb. From behind them, the younger engineers murmured jokes again, but this time Elise noticed Daniel's shoulders stiffen slightly, as if the noise made it harder for him to think. The previous chapter had raised questions the crew didn't openly address. Why the mine looked unfinished despite months of tests, why Daniel avoided the mess hall most nights, and why Elise insisted on staying late after every failed attempt. These questions hung between them now, quiet but present. When the crane operator called out that the mine was secure, Daniel checked the clamps one more time. Elise watched him work with a patience she rarely showed to anyone else. She realized she didn't actually know where he slept or whether he had anyone writing to him from home. The officer had introduced him as a corporal with mechanical specialization, nothing more. The silence around his personal life made her curious in a way she didn't expect. She sensed something wounded there, something that explained the way he stared at the ocean during his breaks. "Clamps holding," Daniel finally said, stepping back. His breath came out in a short cloud, but not for long-term use. Elise opened her notebook and wrote the line carefully. "I'll recommend replacement." "They want to prove it," he answered. She looked up. "You sound certain." "I've seen this before. Equipment fails 5 times, works once, and they call it efficient." He shrugged with a calm that didn't match the frustration in his voice. "They want numbers, not safety." It was the longest sentence she had heard him say. Elise didn't smile, but she felt something shift, an alignment, a recognition that he understood the same kind of indifference she had seen in Europe, where decisions made far away shaped who lived and who didn't. The officer gave the signal. The mine hit the water and disappeared beneath the surface. A few seconds later, the indicator lights on the console flickered. The pressure sensors activated, but the detection timing lagged. Another flawed run. Another quiet disappointment. The team packed up most of the gear and headed back toward the huts, but Elise and Daniel stayed behind. She checked the faulty readings while he rewound the cables, their breath loud in the cold air. When the others finally left earshot, Elise decided to address one of the questions forming in the listeners' minds: why Daniel avoided the group. "Daniel," she said carefully, "you don't eat with the others. You always leave early." He didn't stop working, but his voice dropped. "It's easier that way." "Easier than what?" He paused, then coiled the last stretch of cable with mechanical precision. "Then listening to sailors talk about home." Elise lowered her clipboard. "Is it because of your brother?" He didn't ask how she knew. He simply nodded once. The ocean took him. I don't want to hear stories about families waiting at the docks." Elise didn't respond immediately. The wind carried the sound of the waves up the rocks. When she finally spoke, her tone matched the steadiness he had shown her the day before. "You're here, so that doesn't happen to other families." He met her eyes, and for the first time, there was something vulnerable there, an unspoken truth that he wasn't certain the mine would save anyone. But he didn't argue. As they returned to the test site, Daniel surprised her with a quiet question of his own. "Why are you really here? They said you were a refugee, but that's not the only reason." Elise hesitated. The memories came back too easily. The night she left France, the road lit by burning buildings, the weight of fear pressing into her ribs as she crossed the border. She had never shared the details with the Americans. But Daniel had given her honesty, so she returned it. "I worked with a resistance cell," she said. "We sabotaged supply lines. When our area was compromised, I became a target. The Allies pulled me out. They wanted my experience for explosives research. She exhaled slowly, steadying her voice. I stayed because it's the only way I can contribute now. I don't have a home to go back to. Daniel nodded, as if this filled in a blank space he had been trying to understand about her. They reached the equipment shack to store the last tools. The generator hummed loudly, its steady vibration filling the small space. Elise placed her notebook on the table and leaned against the wall for a moment, letting her shoulders relax. Daniel removed his gloves and set them beside the toolbox. Tomorrow, he said, we adjust the timing relay. She raised her eyebrows slightly. That wasn't on the officer's plan. It should be. He gave a small, controlled breath. If we don't fix it now, this mine will collapse in real conditions. And if a ship hits it at the wrong angle, it won't detonate. That's the truth they won't write in the report. Elise considered his words, understanding immediately what he meant. They were the only ones taking this assignment seriously. The others were waiting for orders to return to safer stations. Elise and Daniel were the only two people on this coast who believed the mine needed to work for real. Not for statistics, not for command approval, but for the men whose lives depended on it. She nodded. Then we adjust it. Good, he said. We'll start early. The chapter closes with them stepping outside together. The wind pushed through the grass near the cliffs. The sun never fully broke through the clouds, but the gray light gave everything a sharp, clear look. Elise watched Daniel walk beside her, quiet, steady, carrying a weight she now understood. She felt something similar in herself. Neither of them said it aloud, but it was obvious now. They were no longer working alone. They were becoming a team, shaped not by orders, but by shared losses and the quiet determination to prevent another one. The next morning came earlier than either of them expected. Elise woke to the sound of wind slamming against the wooden walls of her hut. The generator buzzed somewhere in the distance, its steady rhythm cutting through the cold air. She dressed quickly, knowing Daniel would already be outside. When she stepped onto the gravel path, she found him near the test platform, tightening bolts on the timing relay unit just as he had promised. His jacket was pulled tight, his gloves already stained with machine oil. He glanced at her only briefly before returning to the relay. It wasn't rudeness, it was concentration. Their decision to take control of the project raised several questions that listeners might wonder about. Why the officers allowed them to work unsupervised, why no one questioned their long hours, why their station seemed so understaffed. Elise understood the answer clearly. This post was considered low priority. The commanders didn't believe the mine would amount to anything, so they paid little attention to who handled the details. It was the perfect place for two people who needed the freedom to work without interruption. Relays still unstable, Daniel muttered. He tapped the casing lightly. If a ship passes over too fast, it won't trigger. Elise knelt beside him, checking the readings. We need to shorten the activation delay. That's what I'm doing. The wind blew her hair across her face as she leaned closer, her fingers moving with precision. They worked without raising their voices. Their movements matched in a way that came from trust built quietly, not from orders given loudly. For Elise, the silence between them grew more comfortable each day. As they finished the relay adjustments, the officer in charge appeared from behind the storage crates. His boots hit the wooden planks with impatience. "You two are early," he said. Elise straightened immediately. "We wanted to correct yesterday's timing error." "You'll have your chance," he replied, checking the sky. "Weather's turning, but command wants one more test before noon." Daniel exchanged a quick look with Elise. The clouds had thickened. The sea was rough. Conducting a test in those conditions was risky. Still, Elise nodded. "We'll prepare it." The team gathered shortly after. The crane operator warmed up the controls while the younger engineers joked again about how pointless the tests were. Elise ignored them, but Daniel's face tightened in a way she had learned to recognize. Impatience mixed with quiet anger. He didn't respond, but he kept his eyes on the mine. Questions from earlier chapters also lingered in the background. How did Elise handle seeing a device she built sink into dangerous waters every day? And why did Daniel keep staring at the horizon as if expecting something to appear? Chapter 3 naturally brought these unspoken details to the front. As they approached the crane, Daniel suddenly paused and pointed out toward the water. Look, Elise followed his gaze. Something dark moved through the mist. It wasn't large at first glance, but it cut through the waves with purpose, faster than any Allied vessel stationed near the test site. The officer lifted his binoculars, then froze. Destroyer. German. The mood of the entire team shifted instantly. Conversation stopped. Breath caught in throats. The quiet coastal site had no artillery, no defenses. This remote location had always been considered too unimportant to draw enemy attention. But the war didn't follow expectations. The officer shouted, "Shut everything down, move equipment back." But it was too late. The enemy ship was closing in with surprising speed, its bow pushing through the waves like a blade. Elise felt her pulse spike as she realized something the officer had missed. The destroyer was already within detection range. "If they see us, we're captured," Elise whispered. She gripped her clipboard so tightly her hand began to shake. The memories of her escape from France surged forward. The checkpoints, the shouting, the fear of being recognized. She hadn't felt this level of panic in months. Daniel turned to the officer. "Sir, the mine is armed and ready for deployment. If we drop it now, there's a chance." "You're not authorized to make that decision," the officer snapped. "They're already in range," Daniel insisted, his voice low but steady. "If we don't deploy, they'll spot the platform." Elise felt the weight of the moment settle on her. This was the same fear she carried from France. The feeling that the enemy was always closer than anyone realized. The destroyer wasn't here by accident. It was searching. She took a step forward. "Sir, Daniel is right. If we launch now, the mine will arm in time." The officer hesitated, torn between protocol and the very real threat approaching them. The crew looked at each other with fear tightening their faces. Finally, with a tight jaw, he nodded. "Do it." The order snapped the team into motion. Daniel and Elise ran to the crane controls. The wind was stronger now, pushing against them as if trying to slow them down. Daniel grasped the lever and lowered the mine toward the churning water. Elise steadied the chain, her hands slipping slightly from the cold. "Hurry!" someone shouted behind them. As the mine reached the surface, Elise activated the timing sequence. The indicator light glowed weakly at first, then shifted to a stable signal. She exhaled, but her chest remained tight. Daniel leaned close, speaking in a tone meant only for her. "Stay behind the crate when it detonates. The shock wave might reach the platform." She nodded, but her eyes stayed locked on the mine, drifting away from the crane. The destroyer's engine noise was louder now, an angry mechanical growl pushing through the wind. Elise felt her heartbeat match the rhythm of the waves. The mine slipped beneath the water just as the destroyer passed directly over its position. There was a brief second of stillness, so brief it felt unreal. Then the water erupted. The explosion tore upward with brutal force, sending a column of water and metal fragments into the air. The deck beneath Elise's feet trembled. She stumbled back, Daniel catching her arm before she fell. The shockwave slammed against the rocks with a deep, roaring crack. The destroyer lurched, its hull splitting open. Flames burst across its midsection. The team watched in silence as the German ship began to tilt, its bow sinking first. It all happened far faster than Elise expected, 25 seconds, maybe less. The destroyer disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only smoke drifting above the waves. The wind continued, but the world felt strangely still. Elise realized her hands were shaking. Daniel's grip around her arm steadied her, grounding her. She could hear her own breath, sharp and uneven. "We did it," Daniel said quietly. Elise couldn't speak yet. She stared at the water, aware of what the explosion meant. Lives lost, a victory won, and a weapon finally proven. Part of her felt relief. Another part felt cold. But Daniel didn't release her arm. His presence stayed beside her, solid and unspoken. For the first time since arriving on this coast, Elise didn't feel like she was facing the war alone. The roar of the explosion still echoed in Elise's ears long after the destroyer disappeared beneath the waves. The officers finally ordered everyone back to the huts, but no one spoke on the walk up the hill. Boots dragged on the frozen ground. The wind pushed at their backs, as if trying to hurry them away from the blast site. Elise walked beside Daniel, her breathing still uneven. He didn't try to speak. He stayed close, ready to steady her if she stumbled again. Inside the command hut, the heat from the small iron stove barely reached the far corners of the room. The officers gathered around the table, papers scattered, radios buzzing. A debrief began immediately. Elise and Daniel stood in front of the officers while the rest of the team waited outside. This moment raised several lingering questions the audience might have wondered since the early chapters. How the command would respond to their unauthorized decision, whether the mine's success would actually matter, and how Elise and Daniel would handle the responsibility of sinking a ship. Chapter 4 brings these uncertainties forward and resolves them naturally. The senior officer leaned forward. "Walk us through your decision." Every step. Daniel straightened, his jaw tight. When the destroyer appeared, we had 20 to 30 seconds before they spotted the platform. The mine was armed. We were the only defense available. Elise spoke next, her voice steady but soft. If we hesitated, they would have taken the station. We would be prisoners and the coastline compromised. The officers exchanged tense glances, weighing their answers. The room felt small, almost airless. Elise could see their worry, not about her safety or Daniel's, but about what command would say to them. Finally, the senior officer sighed. "You acted without authorization, but your decision saved this station. And possibly more." Daniel lowered his eyes. Elise felt a wave of relief wash over her shoulders. Another officer added, "Command will want a full report, starting tonight." That meant hours of writing, interviews, and scrutiny. But Elise wasn't afraid of any of that. The sinking of the destroyer had filled her with something unfamiliar, a sense of purpose strong enough to push back against the cold that always lived in her chest. When they were dismissed, Elise stepped outside and inhaled deeply. The cold air cleared her thoughts. The sky was turning darker, the clouds thickening as evening approached. Daniel followed her out, closing the door quietly. "You all right?" he asked. She hesitated. "I don't know yet." He nodded in understanding. "That makes two of us." They walked toward the generator shack where the mine's damaged relay had been stored before the attack. The team had left tools scattered everywhere in their rush to retreat. Elise crouched to gather them, the familiar motions grounding her. Daniel picked up the heavier equipment, his hands moving with a calm steadiness. "You should sit for a minute," Daniel said, noticing the tension in her shoulders. "No," she answered quietly. "If I sit, I'll start thinking about what happened." He considered this, then continued stacking equipment without pushing her further. One of the gaps from earlier chapters, how Elise handled the emotional cost of building something that could kill, now surfaced. She finally addressed it, not in a dramatic confession, but in a simple, honest sentence. "I didn't expect it to happen so fast," she said. "The explosion, the ship, the sinking." Daniel paused. "No one expects it. Not the first time." She looked up at him. "Was it like that for your brother?" His gaze drifted away toward the horizon. "I wasn't there. I only saw the telegram. But they said the ship went down in minutes. That's why I wanted this mine to work. Not to destroy ships, just to give ours a chance." Elise understood now that Daniel's attachment to this assignment wasn't mechanical. It was personal. He wasn't trying to build a weapon. He was trying to prevent another death like the one that haunted him. By the time night fell, the officers had called them again for the written report. Daniel and Elise sat side by side at a wooden table, papers spread in front of them, lanterns casting stiff yellow light across their hands. The rest of the team slept or played cards in the mess hall, relieved the threat had vanished. But Elise and Daniel worked in silence, their pens scratching across the paper as they described every detail: wind speed, relay stability, cable tension, the destroyer's trajectory. Hours passed. Daniel's handwriting grew slower. Elise's fingers cramped. Still, neither complained. At one point, Daniel leaned back and rubbed his eyes. "You should rest," he said. So should you, she replied. He gave a tired half-smile. I won't if you won't. For the first time since arriving at the outpost, Elise felt something warm and steady settle inside her. Not excitement, not relief, just certainty. She trusted this man, not because of heroism, not because of rank, but because he showed up when everything else was falling apart. When they finally finished the reports, the officers dismissed them for the night. Elise stepped outside into the cold again. Snow had begun to fall, thin flakes carried sideways by the wind. Daniel stood beside her, his breath visible in the air. Tomorrow, he said, they'll want us back on the platform. Command will need proof the mine wasn't a one-time success. Elise nodded slowly. That was another unspoken question the audience might wonder, whether the mine could be reproduced, whether its success was luck or skill. We'll fix what's left, she said, and we'll make sure it works again. Daniel looked at her with a steady seriousness. I'm with you. The words were simple, but they carried weight. After everything that had happened, neither of them wanted to face the next test alone. They walked back toward their huts together, the snow crunching softly under their boots. The fear of the day lingered, but now it rested under something stronger, trust built through survival, carried into the quiet night. Snow continued falling through the night, coating the test site in a thin white layer that softened the sharpness of the rocks and wooden structures. By dawn, the wind had calmed, leaving behind a cold stillness that made every sound sharper. Elise stepped out of her hut and pulled her coat tighter, noticing the tracks leading toward the platform. Daniel had already begun working. She found him checking the cables, tools laid out neatly beside him. He looked tired, but focused, steady in a way that told her he had been awake for hours. The officers wanted a second demonstration as soon as weather allowed, and Daniel understood better than anyone what another failure would mean. One destroyer sinking could be dismissed as luck. A second successful deployment would force command to take the mine seriously. Elise joined him quietly. How long have you been out here? Long enough to see the relay still needs adjustment, he said, not looking away from the wiring. I didn't want the officers touching it. She knelt beside him. Then we fix it together. This addressed a question from earlier chapters, whether Elise and Daniel would continue working as a team or drift back into their separate roles. The answer was clear now. Neither of them wanted to go back to working alone. They spent the morning repairing the damage left from the explosion shockwave. Elise's hands moved with methodical precision as she replaced burnt fuses, while Daniel tightened bolts and rewired the timing device. When the officers finally appeared, they paused, observing how the two worked side by side, as if they had trained together for years. The senior officer cleared his throat. Command received your reports, he said. They've ordered the mine into further development. Today's test will confirm it. Elise exchanged a look with Daniel. This was it, the moment that would determine the future of their work and possibly their lives after the war. The team gathered for the second test. Unlike the chaos of the previous day, the ocean remained calm. The crane operator lowered the mine toward the water with controlled precision. Every movement felt heavier, more deliberate. Elise watched the indicator lights closely, tracking each signal. We're stable, she said. Daniel nodded. Releasing in 3, 2, 1. The mine slipped beneath the surface. The console blinked once, then shifted into the correct sequence. Elise held her breath, waiting for any sign of delay. The sensors activated exactly on time. The officers exchanged surprised glances. This was the first completely clean result since the project began. Not a glitch, not a hesitation. Daniel exhaled slowly. It works. Elise felt something inside her loosen, a knot she hadn't realized she carried since arriving at the station. For the first time, she believed the device might actually save sailors, not just destroy enemy ships. The officers called for a final shutdown, but they were no longer skeptical. The expressions on their faces had changed. Respect replaced dismissal. Caution replaced mockery. One of the younger engineers approached Elise and Daniel with an awkward, almost embarrassed smile. Good work, he muttered. Elise didn't gloat. She simply nodded and returned to her tools. Daniel did the same. They weren't after recognition. They wanted results. Later that evening, Command sent another message. The mine would be adopted into production. Elise and Daniel were officially assigned as primary technicians on the project. They would be transferred to a larger facility within the month, and Elise would receive long-term protection status as part of her contribution. This answered another lingering question: whether Elise, as a refugee, would face uncertainty after the war. Now, she wouldn't. She had a future recognized by the Allied command. When Elise stepped outside that night, Daniel followed, closing the hut door behind him. The sky was clear for the first time in days. Stars stretched across the darkness, sharp and bright. "You did well today," he said. "So did you." He looked toward the sea, expression softer than she had ever seen. "When the destroyer sank, I kept thinking about my brother. I thought I'd feel anger or relief or something I could name. But I didn't." He paused, searching for words. "What I felt was that maybe what we're doing here matters." Elise studied him quietly. "It does. And you," he continued, turning to her, "you've carried more than anyone here knows. I don't think I understood how much until yesterday." She swallowed, her voice low. "You didn't have to understand. It was enough that you stood beside me." He took a step closer. The cold air didn't feel as sharp anymore. "I don't want this to end when we leave this station." Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with something warm, something steady. "I don't want that either." He nodded, relieved. "Then we go together." The statement wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It was real and deliberate, just like everything between them had been since the day they met. Weeks passed quickly. The station packed up equipment. The team moved on to new assignments, and the test grounds returned to silence. On their final morning, Elise and Daniel stood at the cliff's edge, the ocean stretching out before them. The place that once felt cold and isolating now felt like the beginning of something better. Daniel lifted their bags. Elise wrapped her scarf tighter. They walked toward the transport truck, waiting on the road above the cliffs. They didn't look back. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time, they weren't facing it alone. Their partnership, built through fear, decisions made under pressure, quiet loyalty, and shared survival, had turned into something lasting. And as the truck drove away from the coast, Elise rested her shoulder lightly against Daniel's. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They had already chosen the same direction, together, and that was the beginning of their peace.